In the last few months, Nicaragua has been on the news every day. On April 18 of this year, the protest in Nicaragua has been the headlines throughout the world. In order to understand better what is happening in Nicaragua, we have here in the studio Camilo Mejia. Who is Camilo Mejia? He is well known for being the first combat soldier to publicly refuse to return to the war in Iraq in 2003. Camilo Mejia is also the son of the very well-known singer and songwriter Carlos Mejia Godoy. Welcome, Camilo. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you, Camilo. Let's talk about what is happening in Nicaragua in these days.
To put it in simple terms, Nicaragua right now is being the subject of a form of aggression by the United States known as a soft coup. Other people know this modality of regime change as color revolution. It's pretty much the same thing. It's an NGO-led, financed, and orchestrated 100% by the United States, as under the guise of pro-democracy protest to overthrow the democratically elected government of Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo, in order to turn Nicaragua into a cheap market for transnational companies to ransack, basically.
Mm-hmm. And how was Nicaragua before the protests began?
Well, this is a very important question in understanding the reality in contrast to what is being said about Nicaragua. Nicaragua, prior to April 18th, which is when the first protest broke out, was one of the safest countries in Latin America. Nicaragua was a country that did not have a gang problem like other Central American neighbors that have the Maras, that were in fact deported from California largely. Nicaragua is a country that sustained steady economic development at 5% for the last few years. Nicaragua is a country where Nicaraguans themselves produced up to between 80 and 90% of our food. So we still have food sovereignty. Nicaragua is a country that offers universal health care to all of its citizens, including medicine, including treatment for chronic disease, including treatment overseas if needed. Nicaragua is a country where education is free, where children in primary school receive not only free education but food as well, free secondary and university education. Nicaragua is a country that was a model in terms of not only economic growth but also the treatment of its poorest citizens. I challenge people to do a quick search of genocide or massacres or any kind of violent upheaval in the country prior to April 18th, because the narrative that's being pushed through social media and corporate Western media is that people got fed up with dictatorship, that people were fed up with the way that President Ortega was running the country, the corruption, the enrichment of a select few, when the reality is very different. The reality is that we were actually doing rather well. We were peaceful. We were a mecca for regional tourism. And all of that came to an abrupt end on April 18th. So I think that this is one of the things that could give people, a more balanced perspective on what's happening in Nicaragua. Elections just took place in 2016. The Sandinista party led by Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo received 72% of the popular vote, and there was 68% turnout. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people say that there was a boycott, but 68% of Nicaraguans turned out. The elections were supervised by the Organization of American States. So this narrative that the people got fed up and took to the streets to overthrow the government could not be farther from the truth. What is happening is a power struggle led by the elite with the financing and guidance of the United States in order to overthrow the government and, like I said before, to turn it into a cheap market for neoliberal banking institutions.
So if I ask you what and who is behind the protest, would you say United States or what? Who is behind the protest?
It's a little bit more complicated than the United States. The simple answer is yes, United States. The European Union has also contributed to some of these organizations that are leading the charge against the government. It's basically neoliberal institutions. It's transnational companies that work through a network of non-government organizations, NGOs or nonprofits, that are financed mostly by the U.S. Agency for International Development and the National Endowment for Democracy and its affiliate organizations. These are organizations that operate all over the world. They apply the same formula wherever there's a government that does not fully comply with the dictates of neoliberal institutions. In Nicaragua, basically, if you look at the background of behind the protests, what you have is a series of reforms pushed by the International Monetary Fund and endorsed by the elite in Nicaragua, the more powerful business people in Nicaragua, that met a counter reform proposed by the government. And basically what it was, the Sandinista government created an initiative for retirement that included people who had been killed during the war, some 60,000 people who left behind relatives. And a lot of the people who are taking retirement benefits are the relatives of people who died as a result of the war. It includes people who did not contribute enough to their Social Security because we didn't really have a formal economy due to the war and the embargo and other ways in which the revolution was attacked, and people who were basically destitute. And the IMF reform basically called for the Nicaraguan government to exclude those people from the retirement system, the Social Security system, and to increase the retirement age from 60 to 65, and to double the amount of contributions that would qualify a person to draw retirement benefits from 750 contributions to 1,500 contributions. And so the Sandinista government countered that proposal with a transfer of 5% from the financial benefit, retirement benefit, into the medical benefit because the retirement includes health care. And so it was basically a transfer of 5% from the actual check into the actual medical benefit. They also proposed an increase in contributions by employees and employers of 0.75 and 2.75% respectively. And they rejected changing the retirement age from 60 to 65 or doubling the amount of contributions that would qualify someone to retire, as well as they removed a ceiling on Nicaragua's top salaries so that the wealthiest in Nicaragua would pay taxes in accordance with their income. This, of course, led to a very powerful business lobby in Nicaragua that's part of the consensus table through which the government runs the country, basically, which is known as the Supreme Council of Private Enterprise, or COSEP for its abbreviation in Spanish, who called the protest, which did not include any retirees, because the Sandinista government is a government of consensus. They had already consulted retirees, and the retirees were happy with the counter reforms proposed by the Sandinista government. But the protests were basically led by students, having been called by this business lobby known as COSEP. And initially were very small. On April 18th, there were just a few students. They were met with other opposition groups, that are close to the government, but nothing major happened. What was reported, though, that a student had been killed by state repression, and that served as a platform for more and stronger protest. The first one being the next day on April 19th, where they said that once again the government had ordered a massacre of students. In reality, only one student was killed of 3 people. One was a person who was not related to the protest, and another one was a police officer. And they all died as the result of gunshot wounds that were fired from, by long-distance rifles, indicating the presence of sharpshooters, which is also something that we have seen in other parts of the world when these soft coups have taken place. The news were manipulated from then on to say that the government was massacring students and that the protest was peaceful. In reality, it was not peaceful from the beginning because 2 people died who were not protesters in the same fashion as the student who was killed. And then from then on, we see basically a rampage of violence that engulfed the country, that included the burning down of public buildings, schools, Sandinista houses, party houses, ministries, universities were ransacked, and we found out about that later. And then the narrative being always that basically like this government that had been such an example of good governance had overnight turned into a genocidal government that was going after not only its own citizens and students, but also against its own institutions, against its own buildings, and against people from the Sandinista party itself. This is all part of a narrative that's fueled by manipulated images, manipulated pictures, the use of symbols, the use of particular messaging tactics that are basically taught by the organizations that are financed by this network of USAID and NED-led civil society groups. So what we saw was basically a very coordinated effort to portray the Sandinista government as genocidal, to portray the situation as one of popular uprising, because people were allegedly fed up with corruption and bad governance and whatnot, when in reality what we have is the exact opposite. What we have is an alleged revolution that is nothing more than a regime change operation disguised as a pro-democracy protest.
And Camilo, you come from a family who is very well known of being using the music in order to bring the peace, the justice, and can you tell us now, why are so many progressive and human rights organizations supporting the opposition?
Indeed. Historically, Nicaraguan society has been very polarized. And this is something that you can see not only at the national level, but also at the family level, where you have families that some have been Sandinista forever, and some members of the family have been anti-Sandinista for a long time. So this is not something new. What is new is the split that has taken place within the left, not only in Nicaragua, but worldwide. And it all responds to this new design of regime change that's known as the soft coup, which it's grounded in the work of political analyst and writer in the United States known as named Gene Sharp. He passed away a couple of years ago. That it's basically called From Dictatorship to Democracy, and it's a nonviolent guide for basically government overthrow. There's nothing nonviolent about it. What they do is that they ground their efforts in civil society organizations financed by USAID and NED that do work related to social justice causes and having to do with education, having to do with LGBTQ issue, feminism, healthcare, and things like that, that work alongside political parties and create an atmosphere that's very much anti-government, that operates under the guise of pro-democracy activities. This is where students are trained on how to make something go viral, for instance, how to use symbols, how to use specific messaging to create a mirage of dictatorship, to create a mirage of genocide, to turn public opinion, not only at the national level, but also at the international level against a particular government that is not in line 100% with neoliberal treaties and reforms and things like that. What's happened in Nicaragua is that there was a split after the Frente Sandinista lost the election in 1990. A lot of people did not understand that as what it was, which was an effort to destroy Sandinismo, but simply looked at it as a loss at the polls. a loss of an election. And they wanted to assume a more pro-neoliberal attitude and basically play nice with the United States and neoliberal institutions and try to basically take over the party and nominate Sergio Ramirez Mercado, who had been Daniel Ortega's vice president, for the presidential ticket. The assembly inside the party rejected that, and Mr. Ramirez took his base from within the party and formed the MRS, which stands for Movimiento de Renovación Sandinista, Renovation Sandinista Movement. And these were the people who tended to be more affluent, tended to have more of a formal education, to speak other languages. A lot of the intellectuals, the writers, musicians like my father, basically gravitated towards the MRS. And the MRS itself gravitated towards the right, the oligarchy, and towards the NGO world, basically. And so a lot of the people who were Sandinistas during the first period and prior to the overthrow of the Somoza dictatorship were the ones who basically became more right-wing from the beginning. They dropped any kind of political platform and adopted the platform of the right, which led to them losing their popular base. When they ran for elections, the first time I believe they got 1.3% of the popular vote. But they were also the people who were the ones in charge of handling international relations. A lot of them were diplomats. A lot of them held, cultivated, and maintained solidarity networks, sister city initiatives, and things like that. Like I said before, these were the ones who had an international projection. And so a lot of people who were once with the Sandinista government or who did solidarity work in Nicaragua have only members of the MRS as their line of communication between them and Nicaragua. And so that relationship between these people who were once Sandinistas but no longer are Sandinistas, but who are like very much right-wing and who are very much financed 100% by US agencies and by European Union, are the ones who are basically leading this coup. And so that's why you see a huge split in the left. It's because a lot of people are confused that you have a lot of historic former Sandinistas leading the charge against the Ortega Murillo administration. And that has created a lot of confusion. To that, you have to add the power of media, the power of social media, the manipulation of images, the use of symbols, like I said before, and the entire machinery of Western corporate media basically backing the coup and providing one narrative, which is the government is genocidal, the government is murderers, and this is a popular movement, and in reality it's the exact opposite.
Okay, thank you, Camilo. We, by understanding the important role of the media, tell us how many people, as far as you know, have died in this crisis, and who is responsible for that, for those lives?
So before I answer that question, I want to say that death is basically an integral part of this soft coup design. Death is like one of the top weapons that they have to change public opinion, to generate hatred and rejection against the Sandinista government and any government that is the target of regime change. A lot of it is manipulated. They are talking about close to 500 people who have been killed as the direct result of government repression. The number is really hard to determine, because a lot of the human rights organizations that are operating and that are producing these reports are completely biased, and they have a political agenda that's against the government. And they have included in their reports people who died of unrelated causes like heart attacks, armed robbery, gang rivalry. Some of the people are repeated in the list. Some of the people are not dead, they turned out alive somewhere. And then also because one thing that people really need to understand in order to understand the whole death, the monopoly of death, is that the opposition has never been peaceful. Like I mentioned before, from the first day when people started dying as a result of the protest, which was April 19th, not 18th. The people who died were not unarmed students entirely. You know, one was a student, one was a police officer, again, one was an unrelated passerby. And so what we have seen basically is like this portrayal of a peaceful protest against a oppressive regime, when in reality what's happened is that the police have encountered heavily armed opposition, you know, every step of the way. And so who's responsible for the killings? It's a combination. It's people confronting the police with heavy weapons, with AK-47s, shotguns, pistols, homemade weapons, and things like that. And so some have died as the result of armed confrontations with the government. A lot of them, like I said before, died of unrelated causes. A lot of them, we don't even know if they're dead because there's not enough information. One of the people included in one of these reports only had an alias, didn't even have a name or a picture. And so it's incredibly difficult. I think the figure is closer to 200, maybe less than that. And I think that approximately 20% of the people are from the opposition. Like I said, that doesn't mean that they're peaceful protesters. It just means that they died at either a march or they died at a confrontation, at a roadblock that they have set up to put pressure on the government. So I think it's closer to less than 200, maybe 195, 180. And I think that a great number of them are also Sandinistas, because another thing that has happened, it's a political persecution of Sandinistas. And we have seen this unfold in the most brutal way through these tranques, and then also through a lot of the protests, you know, that have seen the killing of police officers, over 20 of them plus hundreds of wounded, who have been killed by elements within the opposition. The Sandinistas have been assassinated, persecuted, their homes have been marked. In some cases, they have been burned in public and mocked in public. There's a very famous case of a historic Sandinista named Francisco El Chele Arauz. He was removing a tranque or a roadblock, and when he was shot by the opposition, then they doused his body with gasoline. They lit it on fire, and then they draped the Sandinista flag on top of the burning body. These are tactics that we have never seen in Nicaragua. These are tactics that we have seen in other parts of Central America, where the Maras have been operating for quite some time and have become basically a political weapon used by the drug cartels that operate in Central America and that work alongside U.S. agencies like USAID, the DEA, regional governments, and whatnot. Honduras right now is on its third narco term as far as presidency. In El Salvador, the mayor of El Salvador is a member of Arenas, which, as you may remember, is the group that is responsible for killing the Jesuit priest and Monsignor Romero, and that's involved in lots of atrocities. These are the people who are supporting a lot of the student movements, you know, that are leading the charge against the government in Nicaragua. So it's never really been a peaceful protest, and so there's so much fog around the death. And what I would like to invite people to do is to look at these reports with a critical eye, to open them and read them and look at the context in which people died and the information provided, to really understand how death is being used to create this narrative to ultimately overthrow the government.
Okay. And what is the way forward, Camilo?
The way forward, right now it seems as though things are under control in Nicaragua. That might change because USA just announced another $1.5 million in aid for Nicaragua. This aid is going to continue financing a lot of the crime and a lot of the murder and a lot of the agitation that has put us where we are right now. But for the time being, things are calm in Nicaragua. There seems to be an effort to up the political and the international and the diplomatic pressure on Nicaragua. Right now, the Organization of American States is pushing for yet another commission into our affairs. The U.S. government, led by the most right-wing politicians in Congress, including Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen and Senators Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz and Vice President Mike Pence and even President Trump, who have said that Ortega must call for early elections, that there's no end in sight for the violence unless they step down. So the international pressure right now, I think it's the new face, but I don't think that we have seen the end of the upheaval nationally, because the same actors are still there, and they're getting a whole lot of money from the U.S. And I think that this is also something that people really should think about, that what purpose could there be behind a grant of $1.5 million injected into a country that's being overrun by violence and political upheaval? What could you be possibly investing in when the situation is like that? Why would you be calling for elections when there is so much fear and so much death? These are the things that are out there in plain sight that people are not questioning. People read a New York Times article or a Washington Post article or a BBC report, and they basically assume that what they're hearing is true. But if they just take a couple of steps back and they look at the larger context and they look at the history and they do just a little bit of research, a whole different picture will unfold before them.
Yeah. Thank you, Camilo. Is there anything else you want to add?
Well, I would just like to encourage once again viewers to do their own research. We're not being told the truth by corporate media. Look at the history, look at the historical context, look at the entities that are behind this effort. One of the human rights organizations that's led the charge against the government, the Nicaraguan Association Pro Human Rights, was founded by the Reagan administration back in '83 or '84 to whitewash Contra atrocities. The media that are leading the charge against the government are financed also by the National Endowment for Democracy. The entirety of the civil society organizations operating in the country that have taken a very clear stance against the government, 100% of them are financed by either USAID or NED or some other European Union entity. So the information is all out there. Don't believe what you hear. Vet the information, corroborate, find the evidence, because it's all there in plain sight. And I think that if there's any way out of the conflict in Nicaragua, it's going to be through the truth, and people need to find the truth.
Thank you, Camilo.
Thank you.